So first, I just want to say that that outline that we have there, it'll kind of be just a guide, just in case you didn't have enough time to go over the chapter. If you didn't have enough time to go, maybe some of the works that were there in the chapter, kind of like a guide or an outline for you to kind of have a perspective of what we're talking about. But I don't think that we're gonna go necessarily like by each of the writings that are there. I think it might be a good idea, since this chapter is, and I think a lot of the chapters in the book are going to be heavily focused on kind of like giving us a context and a history of what is going on at this time. I think instead of kind of just going through like the history, for example, of Los Inconformes and kind of what it says, I think it might be better if we kind of just focus on trying to analyze it, perhaps in a bit of a deeper level than kind of just like going through, okay, 1924 this happened, 1925 this happened. So, you know, the outline is there kind of like as a guide for us to look at. If you guys, like I said, if you didn't have the chance to necessarily go in depth in each of the chapters, it kind of gives you an overview. But first, so the first thing that I kind of want to start off with is kind of just like going over the Estudio Introductorio, a little bit of an overview of kind of that first beginning introduction that the authors are giving us, and then kind of go more into perhaps a discussion of themes and overarching topics that we see throughout the chapter, which I think there's a few of them that are very important that we see in basically the whole chapter in the different writings. And so like we said last time, this first chapter is giving us that introduction to what the reception of Marxist ideas and the development, this first development in the first 30 in the first 3 decades, the first 30 years of the 20th century. And one of the things that the chapter does, like I said, it's very, like for example, Los Inconformes, very based on giving us a historical context, right? A historical context of, and so not just the debates that were going on, like for example, what we get in Maria Cano, but also kind of giving us that context, centering us kind of like, okay, so this is kind of the world of Colombia at this time. This is the context that the Marxist ideas were received in. And I think, so like I said, I'll just go over a few of these notes on the Estudio Introductorio, so that we can go ahead and kind of have a more in-depth discussion of the chapter. And so one of the most important things in the Introducción is giving us what this context is. So the context in the first 3 decades of the 20th century in Colombia is a period of key developments. And so in this period, not only do we have the kind of what the creation and the development of a proletariat, of a working class, kind of like that birth of the creation of this idea of a working class, right? Because we can't say that in the 19th century there was already a proletariat in Colombia. And I think this is a process that goes on throughout the 20th century, and it doesn't end in the first 3 decades. I think it even keeps going past the first 3 decades, but it's the birth, right? It's the birth of this creation, and the birth of this industrialization process in Colombia that begins in these first decades. And so that's one of the key developments that we get at this time in this history that we're receiving in this chapter. And I think the other part is also the Banana Massacre of 1928. It's mentioned in Los Inconformes, but it's also a big development in Colombian history, and one that keeps on having kind of like an effect on today's history. We look back at the history of the Banana Massacre, and we see this repeating pattern of massacres all over the country. This was kind of one of those first massacres of what we can say it's kind of the agricultural working class that is beginning to rise in Colombia. We also get in these decades the disputes against the selling of Panama, and a certain sense of anti-US stances at this time. Because of the selling of Panama and that clash between losing Panama and kind of remaining with that independence of all of Colombia's sovereignty. Then we have the creation of the Communist Party in 1930, and also coinciding with that is the start of the popular movement under Jorge Eliezer Gaitán. And so those are kind of some of the big developments that are going on during this time, while at the same time, we already have this these anti-socialist ideas. And so these anti-socialist ideas that we see today, even today, they don't come from Uribe, they don't come from the creation of guerrilla forces in Colombia. They come from way back. And when we look at what this chapter tells us, it tells us these ideas begin to spread in the mid to late 19th century. And so by the beginning of the 20th century, we already have these anti-socialist sentiments that are taking over the elite classes of Colombia. Um, and so that's also the context that Marxist ideas are that they come into Colombia at this time already with these anti-socialist sentiments going on during this time. And so with that, the authors kind of, mention once again how Colombia, because of this, and one of the main reasons is this anti-socialist ideas that began to come about in Colombia during this time. Colombia, once again, like they mentioned in the last chapter, in the beginning of the chapter, is a periphery inside the Latin American periphery when it comes to Marxist works. And then, like we were saying, this idea of the proletariat, of a working class, also develops at the same time as Marxist ideas are coming in. However, this need to organize, the need to organize by the subaltern classes begins before this reception of Marxist ideas. And I think we get that with the work of Los Inconformes, which kind of gives us this idea that, this need to organize by the subaltern classes of Colombia begins before even the Marxist ideas come in. And so that's another part of this context that we get, right? So the kind of like the main aspects that we get in this introductory part is giving us that context, like we said. So the anti-socialist ideas that are already brewing up in Colombia since the late 19th century, the development of this proletariat class, and then also this need to organize. And that's the context that we get when Marxist ideas come in. That's the concept that Marxist ideas start being received in Colombia, is kind of those three overarching developments that are going on in the country. And so because Colombia is considered kind of this periphery inside the Latin American periphery, as they mentioned, they also mentioned that at this time, during the first 20 years, there wasn't necessarily Marxist theories or concepts being developed in Colombia, such as, for example, we can say with Maretegui in Peru, for example, like there isn't that necessarily that engagement as there was with necessarily other places. But Gaitán does kind of show in his thesis, Las Ideas Socialistas en Colombia in 1924, it shows an engagement with Marxist works. And I think that they mentioned this part in the introductory writing, where it says es necesario, and it really shows the Gaitán kind of dialectical way of seeing and understanding Colombian reality in his thesis. And so I'm just going to read it real quick. Es necesario que lo viejo muera para que lo nuevo nazca y se fortifique. La tumba del pasado debe ser la cuna del futuro. Lo que hoy parece y se destruye es el abono indispensable para que mañana la semilla nueva se troque en racimo. And so we get this idea that, this dialectical thinking in Gaitán, and so it shows that it wasn't just that, Marxist work was kind of being spread throughout the country, but there was also an engagement with it. And with this, I kind of wanted to pose a small question in case anybody has deep knowledge or has ever delved into looking at what Gaitán meant for Colombian history. There's a lot of questionings of what Gaitán means for Colombian history and for radical or for the social transformation movements in Colombia at this time. Some people argue that he was, that he could be considered what could be a Marxist, but other people say that he could not be considered a Marxist or a socialist in any sense. And so I wanted to see if anybody had any thoughts on Gaitán. And there isn't necessarily too many mentions of Gaitán in this chapter, but I think it's important to kind of talk about who Gaitán was and what he meant for Colombian history. So I don't know if anybody has any comments on Gaitán or anything that they have been able to research, or they know anything about Gaitán that could perhaps help us to get a larger understanding of who Gaitán was for Colombian history. I don't know if anybody would like to make a small point here about Gaitán. it's okay if nobody can. It's just wanted to see if anybody had any.
I think one of the things to talk about is kind of his mobilization and his party's mobilization, UNIR, which was dang, I forgot the acronym of UNIR, but UNIR had its main base within campesinos. So I think that mobilization of campesinos that Gaitan was able to muster up, I think beginning from his advocacy with the victims of the Banana Massacre, I think really kind of speaks to a way in which organizing needs to be more understood within the third world context, or like the Colombian context, not so much just proletarian working class and the urban cities, but also the work or the labor and the people being exploited in the fields.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point, I feel, for this time, specifically because Colombia didn't become an urbanized country until what we can say is probably the 60s. It doesn't become mostly an urban country until the 60s. So I think that the role of campesinado, like you're saying, the role of the rural classes is also an important notion that Gaitan definitely took upon to bring those voices together in the public arenas. Sergio?
Yeah, I don't have like super good knowledge about Gaitan. I'm not very studied on it, but I have looked into it, and from there, I think I would characterize um, his movement and a lot of what he was doing not as Marxist. I think just because he wasn't really calling for a dictatorship of the proletariat or like talking in that way, but I see him as like a national liberation candidate and leader. So in that way, he was very anti-imperialist. He was very for the Colombian worker. He just wasn't he wasn't working theoretically from Marxism. I think from like what I've heard of his speeches, documentaries I've watched, and all that. I could be wrong. I haven't read his works, but that's how I would put it. And I would say because he's so anti-imperialist, he was still extremely dangerous to like the neo-colonial order, and that's why they killed him. And
Right.
I think Marxists at the time were, I think the party, the PCC, was behind him as well. Not in his campaign or anything, but they supported his campaign because they saw it as an important development.
Yeah. I think at some point the PCC kind of got behind the movement, maybe probably after the mid 30s. But yeah, I said here, like you're saying, he had a deep anti-imperialist stance, and that made him a danger, not only to the imperialist nature of what Colombia is, but also to the political classes of Colombia and the power that they held through that imperialism. So
Yeah, no, I was also I think that's like spot on, and like also thinking about other like leaders in Latin American history, like Juan Jose Arevalo from Guatemala, his spiritual socialism, which was nothing like necessarily Soviet socialism or any type of Marxism, but it was this almost sort of a beginning of a decolonial stage, or like a national liberation stage, in which we can see like the popular classes, not just urban working class, but oppressed indigenous and Afro Colombian communities and campesinos being able to have a candidate, which like Sergio said, was so dangerous that they had to kill him. Like him advocating against and mobilizing population against the OAS when it was being created in Bogota. That's so dangerous to the American empire world order. So it's like it's such a good thing to be talking about someone like Gaitan too.
yeah, and he definitely plays a role in all these movements and how they started viewing this imperialist epoch that was going on. And see, Carlos.
Yeah, and I just wanted to quickly add that it's kind of similar to what happened in Cuba. Before 1959, the revolutionaries weren't necessarily Marxists and socialists, and it's the same with Gaitan. And I think it's important to see Gaitan as an important revolutionary figure in Colombia, because he saw, even though he wasn't Marxist, he spoke to the people's struggle. He spoke to the people's conditions, to the national condition of being a victim of imperialism and stuff. So you know, just because some of us are Marxists doesn't mean that Gaitan wasn't a revolutionary and wasn't contributing a lot to the revolutionary transformation of Colombia. It's very important, super important. I agree with all of you.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. So I think Gaitan kind of shows us that engagement with these anti-imperialist, decolonial debates that were going on at this time, and one of the most important figures in that movement. And so okay, so that's good with Gaitan. I think that I want to go a little bit more about what they give us in the introductory, and then I kind of want to talk about the themes that we perhaps see in this chapter. And so if we go down to, if you could go down a little bit, Ezra, that's good, that's good. So the años de convulsión y profundización del capitalismo en Colombia. So just a quick mention here again about the context that Marxist ideas were being received in during the first decades of the 20th century. So we have these two traditional parties in Colombia that were created in 1848, the conservatives and liberals, and they're successors of these political factions after independence from Spain. The conservatives, deeply influenced by the Catholic Church, these theocratic ideas coming from Spain, and their economic kind of view of Colombia is kind of like this latifundista view of Colombia. And then we have the liberals, on the other hand, inspired by these bourgeois ideas coming from France and the French Revolution, ideas of laissez-faire as well, of free trade and modernization, industrialization. And that's kind of like the two traditional parties that we have in Colombia at the time. However, from 1886, we have this movement called Regeneración, or regeneration movement, by the conservatives, which takes over the country until 1930, or they're the party in control until 1930. And so from 1886 to 1930, we have this deep control of the conservatives, which takes the country deeper into what we can describe as this idea of internal colonialism. So we have this colonialism coming from Spain until the independence and even more. And we also have the imperialism that we've been talking about, but then we also have this notion of internal colonialism of these new political classes, or these elite political classes that came out of independence, and they solidify their forms of accumulation of land and also of capital. And it's this concentration of political and economic wealth in the hands of a few, and this gets kind of cemented into Colombian history, into what the development of capitalism is into Colombia. So it's not just the development of capitalism in Colombia, it's also the development of capitalism in Colombia during this conservative hold of the country. And so with this, we get industrialization and this capitalist orientation of export of agricultural goods starting in the late 19th century, and industrialization birthing in the first few decades of the 20th century. And then we also have extreme poverty in faraway rural areas of the country, which generated first waves of migration to the main cities, where a lot of the coffee elite resided, and we're increasing their consumption of imported goods and goods in general. So it is the hegemony of the Conservative Party is very important to understand how these Marxist ideas, the socialist ideas, were being received at this time. And the authors also mentioned that, like we've been kind of mentioning, kind of like the authors have been mentioning in the book, Colombia as a periphery inside a periphery of Latin America, the political formation of these Marxist ideas is slow due to the social and economic, what they call atraso of the country, and the lack of translated works in Spanish. And I think there's a mention of the first copy, or the first translation of Capital by Marx in Spanish isn't done until 1912, 1913. So that kind of also gives us this idea of how slow it is to come to not only Latin America, but also then to Colombia, these works, these Marxist works that are coming into play. And so just to end with this part, so in the chapter, we get 4 different forms of thought represented. One is the literary one, which is the poems by Luis Vidales, which are great poems. If you haven't been able to take a look at them, I suggest you take a look. They're very, very, very beautiful poems to kind of describe, one, the repression, and two, also the Marxist dialectics that they show even in their poems. Then we have the direct and practical, which is Maria Cano, talking about the struggles, the debates that were going on at the time inside the Marxist circles. Then we have one that is very innovative by Torres Giraldo. And the innovative part, I think, is really that title of Los Inconformes, right? This category of Los Inconformes, not just the conception of the proletariat, but this conception of Los Inconformes to talk about the subaltern classes in Colombia, you know, the oppressed classes in Colombia as a whole struggling for a social transformation. And then we have an intellectual one with Luis Eduardo Nieto Arteta. And so that's kind of the overview that we get of that. And like I said, I kind of wanted to first start by asking you guys and asking the group if in reading the chapter, if you had a chance to read the chapter, if you guys noticed any overarching themes that are going on in the chapter, in the different writings, anything that jumped out at you that you would like to discuss, you know, as a group that we can all engage with. I think there are some very important themes that we see throughout the writings that we have here. So I don't know if anybody would like to talk about any of the themes that they caught while reading this chapter of the first debates of Marxism in Colombia. Carlos, your hand stayed up, right? You don't have it up.
Yeah, no, that was from the last one.
Okay, cool.
But yeah, no, I'll just quickly say, you know, and I guess this is obviously what the editors were doing with the way they chose these writings, is to kind of bring, you know, what they say in the introduction to the chapter, which is to show that these are Colombian revolutionaries and intellectuals that were thinking about Marxism, I guess, in the same way that Mariátegui kind of started in Latin America, in terms of thinking of Marxism and in terms of the local conditions and from their own point of views, from our own history. You know, and yeah, you could see that in all of the writing, and I just think it's so important to you know, for those of us interested in this topic in Colombia and in our country, which, as they say in the introduction, a lot of the time they say that it was something it's been something that's imposed on our people. Even today, it's like, you know, when you talk about Marxism, is either something that's imposed from the outside or something that's really alien and only the stuff that supposed terrorists, armed groups do, rather than something that has been developed by our intellectuals, by our people, to kind of explain the conditions in our country. So yeah, you could see that throughout the whole, you know, all of the writings, and I really enjoyed Maria Cano's back and forth with people, and you know, kind of centering Colombia, but also centering the struggles of women. Like, you know, in one part she's like, I don't remember exactly what she says, but she said something like, you know, us women can think for ourselves and you know, kind of develop our own thoughts without, you know, being patronized. Right. And I guess, you know, that's kind of like the same idea as Marxism in Colombia. Like, we can think about Marxism as Colombians in our own right, rather than it being imposed on us.
Right. Yeah, and I think like this chapter really shows us that engagement, that kind of original thinking that we get with Torres Giraldo and Maria Cano, that engagement with these ideas, and that is not imposed, but it's kind of the analysis that these people are making of the reality, of the material reality of our country, and the struggles that come with that. Is how?
one of the things that I kind of like kept on seeing, and like one of the questions that kept coming to my mind when I was reading like Mariacano and then also Inconformes was the cooperation between communists and liberals, or communists and socialists and liberals, and the problematics that can arise from the lack of cooperation. But then at the same time, when we think about like the rise of la violencia, what can happen with the problematics that can happen with cooperation, which can sometimes lead liberal guerrillas to go and attack communist guerrillas because the liberals and the conservatives made peace. So now it's supposed to be like peaceful. So why are you still mobilized? But in reality, like we know why they still had a reason to be mobilized. Like none of the injustices had gone away. And so I think there's a repeating pattern which I see in Mariacano's letters, but also in Inconformes, where like Ignacio Torres talks about that because of a lack of wanting to cooperate with the liberals, communists were shut out of particular mobilizations that were very, very important, and there wasn't any communist leadership behind it, only liberals or something like that. Not to say that like communism is the only way, is what I'm trying to say. Like, I mean, to me, I think we want to get to a communist society, but I do think there needs to be some sort of like cooperation with people that don't necessarily see that at this, like at the present moment.
Yeah.
But I don't know if anybody had any other thoughts about like the problematics that can arise both from cooperation and from the lack of cooperation with liberals.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's, I kind of have a list here of the themes that I kind of noticed, and I think that's the main theme that I noticed throughout these chapters. And I think that it's that, the role of liberalism. And I think Maria Cano, her letters is kind of that context, so she's kind of being blamed as injecting liberalist ideas into the proletariat. That's one of the accusations that they're making of Maria Cano, and that's kind of one of the things that she's arguing against. And so I think that this is one of the main themes that we see in this chapter, that the role of liberalism, what role does it play? What role does like a unified leftist front play in the social transformation of Colombia, the role of non-Marxist or reformists in the social transformation of the country? So, and I think that that's part of the context in the 1920s. So in the 1920s, there is this unified front with leftist liberals against things like La Ley Heroica in 1928. And there's this front, right? There is this front of the leftist forces that is fighting against that. But at the same time, like as I was saying, we also see kind of like the problems that can arise from that cooperation, from that working together. And I think that this is a topic that goes back and forth in Maria Cano's letters, and also in Ignacio Torres in his Inconformes writing. And I think in page 104, if we can go to the writing, to the book real quick. Ezra, I don't know if you have the book open. My bad, I didn't mention anything about that. In page 104, there's a brief quote that I wanted to see for us to take a look at. And it kind of mentions the role that that communists and liberals were having in the struggles. 104. Okay, cool. So if you can go down a little bit towards the okay, right there is good. And so sorry, a little bit more up.
Okay.
Right there is good. So right here it says desde luego, where it says desde luego. Desde luego era reducido el papel de los comunistas en las luchas de los trabajadores, no tanto por su escasa fuerza, sino por su línea política sectaria que les hacía ver a la izquierda liberal como su enemigo principal, y los movimientos que dirigían líderes sociales reformistas como sucesos ajenos a su misión revolucionaria. And so we kind of see these two kind of things that are going on. In the one hand, there is this front in the 1920s, which then kind of it dies down. This leftist front kind of dissipates. It stops being this unified leftist front, and then we have Torres Giraldo kind of criticizing, on the other hand, that this front doesn't exist anymore by the 1930s. And so yeah, I just wanted to bring that's kind of the main thing that I have for this chapter is what role does liberalism play, or the reformists play in the social transformations of the country, specifically Colombia, and that question of con quién hacer la revolución that Maria kind of was asking, with whom to make the revolution. Sergio, please.
So given like the specific conditions of Colombia on that, I'd say I'm very much like a student, and I'm like learning through this book and learning with the group. But in terms of like the general shape of like how Marxists should align themselves with liberals, especially like progressive and social democratic liberals, I've always heard that it's like a tightrope, like a fine line that you walk. It's about principled cooperation. So like within Marxists, I think it's important to know what the ultimate objective is. It's about socialism, and also be aware of like the contradictions between you and the liberal groups. But also, I think the two problems that could happen are like left sectarianism on one side, which is what you described in the book, like having not being able to identify sort of the principal contradiction of the time. Like in Colombia, it's probably like imperialism and putting up a anti-imperialist front. So they, mistook who the main enemy was at the time. But then there's the other thing, which is like right opportunism, where you just submerge yourself in the liberals. And that's what's happened a lot here in the United States with the Marxists here. A lot of the groups historically have been right opportunistic, and they've, at this point they're in like the Democratic Party. Just it's not, so therein are like the two main problems. And our objective, I think, is to study the theory, but also study the history, learn from those mistakes, and do this principled coalition.
Yeah, those are great points, Sergio. Carlos, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I agree with that, and also to, I guess, kind of give a more contemporary comparison. Like for example, today we have people like Petro,
Mm-hmm.
who isn't Marxist, who's progressive, and who I personally, in terms of the long-term structural changes that Colombia needs, I don't think is the answer, but that I do think could be a progressive step towards it, in terms of like ripening the conditions for more radical politics to come in. Because if we at the moment in Colombia, there's no conditions for any kind of leftist politics to thrive. So yeah, it could be a good step. It could be a necessary step towards more radical and, I guess, socialist Marxist politics. And but also, I think I would say, we need to make a difference we need to see the difference between bourgeois liberals and the bourgeois elites who use liberalism to, I guess, stay in power, and then the general population who might have liberal ideas, but that we can unite with, and who, I just say that, like, it's kind of difficult to unite with bourgeois liberals who want to need to keep the status quo, and then liberals in the general population, working class people who have liberal ideas, but who I think we can unite with. I'll just say that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's exactly kind of what I was gonna ask, what is the role of this Pacto Histórico now that since we have this kind of history that is given to us, this unified fronts that have existed in Colombian history. What is the role that Pacto Histórico plays today? How can that be interpreted through a Marxist lens, or through a lens of trying to achieve these social transformations in Colombia? And I think, Carlos, that's a great point. And I think that it's kind of like a tightrope, kind of like I think Sergio was saying, you have to walk that line very carefully. I don't know if anybody would like to point anything else out specifically, or maybe about the Pacto Histórico, what role it plays, how we can interpret that, specifically because I feel like the Pacto Histórico is this big coalition, which has people like Petro and people that are, you know, are trying to change some of the conditions in Colombia. But then at the same time, I feel like the Pacto Histórico does contain some people and some parts of it that are kind of that bourgeois liberals that you were describing, you know. And so I feel like that's also a danger that could come about with something like the Pacto Histórico. At the same time, how do you progress in Colombia when there are no conditions and no space for leftist movements to grow or to develop? Esther, did you want to say something?
I kind of wanted to add just about like Petro, because like, yeah, Petro, I don't really see him as that revolutionary, like, I don't know, kind of he's like the anti-imperialist Bernie Sanders of Colombia. But, you know, many people view him, they're like Petro, Castro, Chavez, as if they're all on the same thing. So it is like, it's like difficult in a country in Colombia where like leftists, specifically like communist radicals, are so like demonized. So I can like see that being good for like trying to like get more radical politics into people and like, you know, trying to like ease people into that. But, you know, yeah, at the same time, like, I think it is like kind of dangerous because you do have a lot of these bourgeois like liberals who are just trying to like maintain what's like going on. So it's like a very fine line to walk.
Yeah, for sure. Sarah?
Yeah, I want to thank Carlos for that main his perspective on that, because in my eyes, and this is like not from a political background, but just like from mutual aid organizing and that sort of thing, like there is a huge difference between the liberals in power and then just like the average person. And I'm sure there's like political language for this, but in my eyes, I view it as like people who are in on it, like people who are in on the lies of liberalism and the manipulation and like they know what they're doing as a means of controlling, versus the people who aren't and have just received the propaganda, but who have like, you know, like they want to be progressive, they want to be feminist, blah, blah, blah. But they just think this is the only option they have. And I feel like in my day-to-day, like non-academic political spaces, like that's where I encounter so much. And I do think there is like, liberalism is so dangerous because of the ways like the people in power can like derail, co-opt, and commercialize movements. But in the day-to-day, to me, and I don't know if this is optimistic, but like I view like potential, right, for radicalizing people, and it's slow, and it's like I'm in the US, it's like the anti-communist propaganda is so deep that like you really do have to like slowly get people into the idea. And I feel like that's in Colombia, and I've seen that because, you know, you'll come into people in like, you know, charity work who like really think they're helping and they want to help and they want to better conditions, but they're like, oh, but I can't be a communist, you know, or whatever, anarchist or whatever the hell. So I think with them, it's like definitely worth, just in terms of like practicality and numbers, even with the hopes of converting them and radicalizing them, and also in the terms of like short term improving the conditions of people's lives, even if it's not systematic change, but in terms of just getting them immediate aid. And so that's just like what came up for me. And I hadn't thought about that, like the difference, like what, you know, like, is it worth working with liberals? You know, like I like haven't really delved into that, but there's like a huge difference. So for sure, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
That's a great point, Sarah. And I think that, like you mentioned, that anti-communism in the US is also kind of translated in Colombia. You know, in Colombia, you see this huge anti-socialist, anti-communist, anything that is related to progressive movements is completely erased, and so that's kind of the propaganda that is fed every day to people. And so that's why it's very important to make that difference between, you know, those people that are fed those liberal ideas and the people that benefit from the liberal bourgeois way of seeing politics in the world. Esau, I think you had enough. I don't know if you wanted to contribute anything here.
Yeah, I was just gonna kind of like talk about what I feel like one of the things we would need to do as like communists to try to really work with liberals and kind of like this principled cooperation, like someone was mentioning. I'm not sure it was Carlos, but like the idea of being able to get more socialist and communist propaganda out for those people to consume, because it's really the counter propaganda to what they've been consuming their whole lives. And I think that's so kind of dangerous to think about in a place like Colombia. Like, I feel like I would feel all right or like safe-ish having a conversation like this, like with all of y'all in public in the US, like in a park or something. But like in Colombia, having a conversation where it's like, I feel like you see throughout the history, anything where there is going to be like a propaganda or an effective machine that's kind of like giving information to people that they're not typically getting, is going to be shut down. We see the bombing of La Alternativa in the 80s, the way Ariel Avila gets death threats basically daily for what he does on YouTube and what he does in general. What happened in the 1920s or 1930s, where there was almost 200 socialist newspapers in Colombia, like Inconformes was saying, and now today, or like 1950s or 1960s, like there's nothing there because they've all been repressed. It's always going to be this like repression of the most radical or the most revolutionary, and then acceptance of the most liberal. And it's I don't know, I was just kind of thinking about the danger of the things that we need to do if we want to work with like liberals, because if working with liberals means working with someone like Gustavo Bolivar in Colombia, which is like, he has like some progressive ideas, but he has houses in like Miami, like a boat in Miami. That's not,
It's also dangerous.
yeah, that's also dangerous. And I feel like that's what would be accepted. And then people like us, or people that were really trying to tell people like, yo, we need to wake up from this. The Colombia is like a US beacon in this Latin America, and we need to change this, not only for us but for the rest of the region. And I feel like that's the things that's going to get even more dangerous.
Right, and especially their effective ways of
Yes.
spreading this propaganda. Sorry, Carlos.
Yeah, just to quickly say that, you know, at the end of the day, and I guess the bottom line is, are you capitalist or are you anti-capitalist? And the liberals, and especially, you know, as we were saying, the I guess the liberals and the elite, and also people like Petro and Gustavo Bolivar, who I think are different. You know, they are different from the elites, from the liberal ruling class. But they still have this idea that, you know, you can reform capitalism and friendly capitalism, which I think, you know, to many of us who study the situation know that it's a contradiction in terms. You can't have friendly capitalism, and so yeah, and I guess in the long term, we know that people like Petro, you know, might be good, might be, you know, good progress for Colombia in the short term, but in the long term, we definitely need, you know, basically the dismantling of capitalism.
Yeah. So, would anybody like to add anything else about kind of that theme that we see in this chapter of the role of liberalism, non-Marxist, in the social transformation of the country? Sí, Mateo.
Yeah, I just have to say, I think a lot of the conversations around like how to convince liberals and how to convince like people who are kind of in between that they should be more radicalized. But I think one of the things that we see really consistent throughout leftism in Colombia is that the place for social change and for inviting people into the revolution is not necessarily going to be like the marketplace, but it's going to be the schools. You know, Gaitan was very famous for the speeches that he was doing all over, even the private like high schools all over Bogota. And I think that's one thing that I found myself, is that like there's that struggle between like, oh, how do we win other people? It's not really like that. It's when it becomes like the like what is talking about here, the social reproduction and the education of youth to expand the possibilities. Because like I think everyone's right when you talk to people born and raised in Bogota, you know, it's like you say activista social and already you're done. just for something basic about like racism, you're done amongst many people of the bourgeois class. But when you start talking to their kids, all of a sudden they don't have that immediate gut reaction. So that's just something that I think I've been kind of redirecting a lot of my own energies away from convincing people who, you know, are already deeply ingrained, entrenched, and committed to the capitalist system, but instead looking for those possibilities of places where that hasn't been as much done.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think, you know, this, yeah, did you want to
Sorry, I wanted to add, I just don't know how to put my hand up now that I'm sharing my screen.
Go ahead, no, you tell you want.
But I actually work at a high school in Colombia, and it's something that I noticed, right? Like I teach high schoolers and I'm like introducing a lot of these concepts to them. Obviously, you know, I'm not like, hey, Marx now, let's talk about these guys. But, you know, I am introducing like these concepts to them, and even though you have to be careful, I have noticed that they're a lot more receptive to them. So yeah, I think like, especially with like the newer generation, yeah, it's definitely like a place to challenge these ideas. And instead of like going with people who, you know, are completely against it, you're not going to change your mind. But there are people who are more like open-minded, who don't think about it in a certain way. So yeah, I agree with Mateo on that one. It's definitely something I also see in my like personal life.
Yeah, and it's kind of that aspect of like the propaganda, you know, like the propaganda that is given since kids are in school, you know, it's kind of like this anti-socialist, anti-communist, anti-progressive kind of a way of looking at the world. And so if you're starting to hit that at that age, you know, in those spaces, then there's definitely going to be a different reception than if you're talking to, you know, people who benefit from the system and are growing. And I think that that's also a chapter that's going to come about in this book. So that's also a great point that we're also going to be looking at later on. Okay, so I don't know if anybody would like to add anything about any other themes that they saw throughout this chapter, any other important things that jumped out or that were kind of like a continuous in the different writings. So I think I just want to mention one that I think is kind of related to kind of these topics that we're talking about. And that's kind of the role of a vanguard party with the masses, you know. And I think that we see this in Los Inconformes a lot. And kind of back to that page 104, not that you have to go back to it, but as we saw in that page of 104, Torres Giraldo mentions that after the creation of the PCC in 1930, the communists began to have less of a role in the workers' struggle until 1935 due to their sectarian views and isolationist line. It was changed after 1935, 1934, 1935. However, he also mentions that aspects of it remained, you know, and that they remained even long after this time. And so I kind of wanted to bring that up to see if anybody wanted to talk about kind of that point. You know, it's very similar to what we were just talking about, but more in relation to the role of what the discussion they were having of the role of a vanguard party, the role of the PCC with the people, with the masses, because they also mentioned that in the 1920s there was no separation between socialists or Marxists and the Workers' movements, but then after 1930 there is a separation, and there is a big separation that Torres Giraldo talks about. And so I don't know if anybody would like to talk about or say anything about that point, the role of the vanguard party, of a specific vanguard party, even today. You know, what is the role of the PCC today, or what has it been throughout the history of Colombia? Sí, Sergio.
I don't know much about the PCC, like in specific. I really hope someone maybe knows something more about that and can add. But I think in terms of the Vanguard Party, I tend to find it to be pretty compelling, just given, because there are a lot of moments in like countries where the workers' movement, the communist movement, they've all been like crushed, and now there's no big organizations, there aren't any structures to funnel discontent through. So we see something like 2020 uprisings from George Floyd's killing in the United States. And we were like, I mean, I think that could have been a revolutionary moment. It could have caused huge gains, at least some concessions. It could have built worker power or something like that. But there was really no way to funnel any of that, to coordinate all the different local organizations. And then you just see stuff like it just kind of fizzles out. So, and then it gets co-opted by liberals. That's like one of the biggest things. No, it doesn't fizzle out, it gets crushed. Let's be like, I'm not gonna not bring that up, but so I think in Colombia, there's also like, you know, moments of discontent. There was late 2019, you know, and I forget what exact, that was the killing of the lawyer. I forget his name. But, yeah, so I think there's these big moments of just the outcry from like the people themselves who are just fed up, but that needs to be, you know, it has to be strategic, and there has to be some kind of force at the front funding it, and like being able to funnel it somehow, or otherwise I don't know how it could really get to revolution. I don't think it happens spontaneously.
Right. Yeah. And I think that, you know, that's a good topic with this paro nacional that's happening now. What would happen if there was this big organized movement, this big organized party that was kind of leading these moments of popular discontent in the nation? You know, I don't know if the paro nacional is gonna, you know, continue after the 28th, but would it be a lot different if there was kind of this big party that was leading it? Carlos?
Yeah, just to quickly say that, you know, we, especially, you know, what they're saying in what it says in the writing, and going back to what happened in the 1930s and 40s, and going back to Gaitan as well, like the relationship between Gaitan and the Communist Party, where they had an opportunity to, you know, I guess strategically unite with Gaitan, which they did at some point, and then eventually they took a more, you know, the thing that they were accused of, the communists are accused of the most, which I think is unfair in Colombia, is that, you know, it's imposed from the outside. But in that particular moment, there was a kind of imposition from the outside, and Gaitan was seen as like this by the communists as like this like kind of, I think they called him like he wanted like fascist nationalism or something like that. And so that was their policy, and I think that was a mistake, you know. And I think that today, the Communist Party today is much more willing to work with people who aren't necessarily Marxists, and I think that's a good thing. And I also think that the reason why it is necessary at this moment in time, and why I don't think that the conditions are right for a vanguard party in Colombia at the moment, is because of the situation, you know, the violent situation that goes on. Like the organic, there can't be an organic growth of the Communist Party, or any, not just necessarily the official Communist Party, or any Marxist revolutionary party in Colombia at the moment, because of the situation, because of, you know, the ruling class doesn't allow it. So I do think that as Marxists, not just the party, but all Marxists need to kind of, I guess, push in all directions, and you know, help the conditions become more right, so there to be if there is going to be a vanguard party in the future, you know, and if that means joining with progressive liberals like Petro and so on, then I think that is what the party, the Communist Party, and other Marxist parties are doing.
Yeah, great point. And I think it's great that we're kind of relating all this, kind of these writings that we're getting from basically 100 years ago, and relating them to what is going on now in Colombia, and the context of it. I think that's one of the important things of this book. You know, it's kind of, you know, looking at these writings to try to understand what mistakes can be reversed, or not reversed, but it changed with moving forward by movements in Colombia that seek that radical transformation, that social transformation that Colombia needs.
I also wanted to add on, like, because I remember like the paro that happened back in like November 28th, 2019, which was like a massive one. And you literally saw people going out, like in Bogota, you saw the whole city shut down, and like you actually saw like the financial effects that you're meant to see from like an actual strike, right? And it was like really amazing to see. And you kind of saw that like momentum sort of continue. But then once again, you could really tell like what the issue was a lack of organization, particularly like in the city, like on the outskirts of the city, and then like more like rural areas, people were going hard. But I noticed like after like with the paro, like it kind of started to like lose that. So you have these like moments like the one that's coming up this Wednesday, you know, and so many people are talking about going, and it's like a lot, you know, they've like increased police and military like surveillance and presence in the cities to try and like intimidate people. So like you definitely have, I think, these like moments and like where like people are coming together, and you know, like they have this anger, they have these issues, but they could like really benefit from some kind of vanguard, some kind of organization. But I don't necessarily see those conditions like for that to exist right now. But it's definitely something that like in these like strikes, I think like the organization, particularly between like the cities and like the rural areas, like that coming together is something that would be really great to see, but it just like lacks right now. So personally, yeah, a vanguard party of some kind, I think would be great. And you could really see these like moments, I think, push forward, but those conditions might not necessarily be here.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that relates kind of to this repression, you know, and this repression that we've been talking about since the late 19th century. These ideas that the elites in the country have had of completely taking out any movements that are challenging the status quo, or wanting any sort of radical change in the country. Yeah, I think that's great. So I don't know if anybody else had anything else to add to the themes, perhaps that they've been thinking about, any themes that you guys mentioned and that you guys were thinking about throughout the chapter. I think one other one that I had relating to the chapter is, and also related to these things that we're talking about, is the deep divisions within Marxism, or within Marxists, that have existed in the country. And I think that's shown by Maria Cano, right? So we have in Maria Cano committed to the social changes in Colombia, committed Marxist, but somebody who in the mid 1930s then was out of the party. You know, she didn't participate in the Communist Party anymore. And we also have Torres Giraldo, which in the 1940s, I believe, after he was the general secretary of the party, he also was outside of the party, and kind of became a figure that didn't participate anymore with the PSC. And so I was wanting to ask you guys, if these divisions, why do these divisions come about within the Marxism, within the movements that are seeking kind of these same radical transformations in the country? And if you guys noticed in the letters anything that jumped out at you guys that perhaps can explain these divisions, especially with Maria Cano, because you know she was deeply committed, and you can see that in the letters. You know, she was deeply committed to the changes in the country, to a communist or socialist ideas of change. However, by 1934, she's out of the party. And so I wanted to ask about these divisions within Marxism that we see here. Why do they come about? What is their place in the history of Colombia too? Anybody had any points that they perhaps thought about?
Yeah, I would say, you know, I think the book itself, and I think the introduction to the chapter itself shows, is telling us, you know, how all the different thinking of the people involved, and hold on one second, of the different people involved, of the different thinkers involved, and how, like say for example, Torres Giraldo's Los Inconformes, and he's trying to, I guess in a very similar way to what Mariátegui was doing. I guess he didn't crystallize his ideas as much as Mariátegui, in terms of like, you know how they say Mariátegui Peruvianized Marxism,
Right.
like, you know, and I guess he, you know, you can see in his writing he's going towards that. Like he's trying to think of like the different social categories that exist in Colombia, you know, beyond the kind of proletariat per se that the original Marxists, or that Marx was talking about. And so I think that because of, you know, those very different intellectuals, different revolutionaries trying to think of, you know, I guess they were autonomous, and of course there are going to be disagreements. And you saw in the letters with Maria Cano, and you saw, I think, Torres Giraldo at some point talks about the deep divisions within the party as well at some point. I can't remember when, in the 1930s. So yeah, I think that there's like, you know, there's a back and forth, there's pushing, there's pulling, and it's a young, very young movement, and you know, it's always going to exist. But yeah, that's all.
I don't know if anybody else wanted to comment on that point. Cool. Okay, so I think with that, I think the last thing that I kind of wanted to look over, kind of just to highlight these things that we were talking about, is that role of liberal ideology or liberalism. And Luis Eduardo Nieto Arteta talks about this. If you could go down to the last part of this chapter, the last part where, Marxismo y Liberalismo. And so this writing is an intellectual piece to kind of get us thinking about this role of liberal ideology and what they were trying to do when Marx's ideas started coming about in Colombia. And so in this writing, he's writing on the efforts by the liberals to insert Marxism into their ideology, kind of saying that the Liberal Party is the one that's going to bring about this revolution, because it's only a small minority in their party that are the bourgeois, but however, they have the majority of their party are part of the masses, and so this is the party that's going to make that revolution. And so Nieto Arteta in this is kind of going against that concept, you know, painting it as the bourgeois minority in that party is the one that holds the means of production, the ones that holds economic power, and this results in their political power, and their objectives are the objectives of the traditional parties, you know. So it is a kind of like a willful rejection, deliberate rejection of this engagement with historical materialism. And that's kind of painted out in page 112, where he says, el poder político es una consecuencia del poder económico. Esto es lo único que puede explicar científicamente el poderío político de las clases dominantes. So kind of this thought of what we were thinking about, what we were mentioning earlier, you know, kind of this division between the kind of masses that have received this liberal ideology, and a difference with those liberals that hold that political power. And so I think that piece also gives us a great point in trying to show us what an interpretation, Marxist interpretation of that liberal ideology could be. And so he ends with kind of pointing out how the class struggle, Marxism paints class struggle in a much different light. You know, it doesn't fit in those reduced limits of a political party of liberals and conservatives. It contains kind of all of these subaltern classes together, going against the interest of their enemies, you know, the industrialists, the landowners of both parties, the economic interest of the bourgeois, and how those are antagonistic to the masses, which is why this unity that which we were talking about, the unity of through a vanguard party, working like, for example, today with the Pacto Histórico, and the importance of that to kind of advance the social transformations in the country. And so I think with that, I kind of want to close by asking if there's anything that while you guys were reading, you guys kind of had any questions about, perhaps for the group, for anybody that could perhaps answer any questions, any concerns about what they were writing that perhaps you didn't understand, or that we could perhaps try to explain a little bit, if anybody had any problems when they were reading, trying to understand any of the points that were being made. Okay, cool. Okay, so I think that's about all that we have. I hope this was a good place for you guys to kind of get your thoughts out on this chapter. I think it's a very interesting chapter because, like we were saying, it not only gives us the debates that were going on at this time, but also the context where these ideas were received. And so I think it really gives us a good picture. It paints a good picture of the development of Marxist thought in Colombia. So if nobody has anything else that they would like to add or say, please, Sergio.
I just wanted to add one thing on the last section, to go back to that real quick.
Yeah.
Not a question, but just to give maybe a couple more concepts that might be helpful. Because this is a trend, of trying to make Marx a liberal, to integrate Marxism into liberalism. Right. And, that's called revisionism. It's when you revise Marxism, you get out of historical materialism. So I just wanted to give the perspective that it's nothing new. It happens every time Marxism starts building up in a country, and we should all learn from this and be able to recognize it, because even when Marx was still alive, there were people trying to tell him what Marxism was and trying to make it liberal. And I think there was even a quote by Marx that said, if that's Marxism, I'm not a Marxist.
Right.
So just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it goes back to that, that appropriation of these Marxist works, of the Marxist concepts of reality, and how they're kind of appropriated by these classes where it doesn't benefit them. And then the kind of the radical revolutionary aspects are erased. It goes with that revisionism. Great point, Sergio. Yeah, so thank you guys so much for coming. Thank you for participating in this. I think it was great to be able to talk about this with you guys. The outline is there if you guys want to have it with you guys. If you guys didn't get a chance to read it before and want to read the chapter afterwards, it kind of gives you a brief overview of the things that are going on in the chapter. Once again, thank you, and we'll keep you guys in the loop.
Thank you for hosting and doing all this. It was very well organized, and I think I learned a lot. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Sam. And can I quickly just add before everyone goes? I know there's some comrades here who aren't from Red Condor, and I would like to add that we do the study group and the information, and which is great, but we also encourage people to to help us out, help our Patreon to help with the different things that we're trying to do, because we feel that information is there as a tool so that we can actually make some tangible contributions to what's happening in Colombia, which is for us the most important thing. El granito de arena, as they say in Colombia. We don't think of ourselves as a vanguard. We don't think of ourselves as necessarily saviors or anything like that. But we do feel that we can give a bit of ourselves to help. So yeah, I'd encourage people to help us out if you want to join or or even if you just want to support us and stuff.
Thank you, Carlos.